Well, good morning and welcome back to the conference. We're going to get started on our third panel this morning. My name is Casey Lazar, and I'm a regional outreach executive based out of Minneapolis Fed's Helena branch in Helena, Montana. And we've seen some excellent presentations this morning and some great dialogue back and forth with the audience on issues relating to labor markets and long-term demographic trends. And for this panel, we're going to make a transition, and we're going to sort of pivot to the sort of human side of the issue of immigration and the experience of our immigrants in our district as it relates to maybe some of the obstacles that we see for our immigrant community, but perhaps more importantly, on some of the creative solutions that are being deployed in our district as it relates to enhancing the immigrant experience here in our 7-state region. We've got a great panel, 3 individuals representing very different communities and different regions throughout the district. And we'll start off with Shahid Hawk. So Shahid has got some prepared remarks for us this morning. Shahid is an immigration attorney and a principal of border crossing law firm in Helena, Montana. In addition to working with thousands of immigrants in the state of Montana, he's also a recipient of the ACLU's Jeanette Rankin Civil Liberties Award. So please help me in welcoming Shahid Hawk.
All right, thank you, Casey. And it's really great to be here. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this panel, and I've really enjoyed watching all the speakers and all the information they've provided, and I especially appreciated the opening discussion with Senator Johnson and President Kashgari. And as you guys are thinking of questions to ask us towards the end of it, I might ask you guys to think back to that initial discussion, and after we've presented our side discussing some of the more human factors of immigration, think back to what they were talking about earlier and see if maybe you want to ask us any questions about that and consider our perspectives on some of those issues. So I come at the issue of immigration as an immigration lawyer. That's how I make my living. That's my bread and butter. And so I also wear 2 hats. I'm also the president of a nonprofit organization called the Montana Immigrant Justice Alliance. And in that role, I've tried to increase public awareness of immigrants in Montana and advocate for immigrant communities in a lot of different ways. And so in terms of finding creative solutions to address immigration problems, one of the most creative solutions I've found is to file federal lawsuits. That's helped a lot in coming up with some creative solutions in Montana. But I have been an immigration attorney for about 13 years, and 10 of those years have been in the state of Montana. I got started practicing immigration law by doing asylum law in Chicago. So I spent quite a bit of time in the Midwest. And when I was in law school and after I graduated from law school, my first clients were asylum seekers who sought admission into the United States for their protection because of persecution in their home countries. And I found that work to be rewarding, and I found that there was actually that attorneys served a really useful role because these asylum seekers are going through a complex process that's very difficult, and the standards of proof are exceptionally high, and the avenues for appeal are not limitless. So there's a it's 2 steps. So that's very limited. Yeah. So that's how I began my work. I came to Montana about 10 years ago, and I noticed that there was a need for an immigration attorney even in the state of Montana. We saw some of the statistics which are right, that Montana only has 2% foreign-born population. And but Montana also has a 4% of its population who have one or more parents who were born outside the country. And so that to me is significant because mixed status families where only one person is a U.S. citizen and the other, one or more of them, their parents are not, or one or more of their siblings are not, I find that a lot of my clients are in that category, and that makes a big difference in terms of how you look at the immigrant population in Montana. So Montana, North Dakota, South Dakota, and Wyoming are amongst the states with the fewest foreign-born. But at the same time, even those states have quite a few people, and they live in various unique ways. They come from different countries, and they all come to Montana for different reasons. And it's been a pleasure over the years to get to know why my clients came here, what they're doing here, and how they've helped their communities. Over the course of the last decade, I've come to represent close to 2,000 immigrants in the state of Montana. And it's been my pleasure to kind of do my part to change things on the issue of immigration by actually keeping families together, helping people apply for citizenship when they're eligible, helping people get green cards, work visas, but also helping people who are in deportation proceedings and finding that there are ways to stop people's deportation or get them legal status, even when they entered the country illegally, even when they overstayed their visa. There are still avenues in our immigration system to get legal status here. And so our immigration system is exceptionally complex, and the avenues for relief are exceptionally complex. And so when you think of people who entered the country illegally, you're not necessarily looking at people who aren't going to be allowed to stay here. They may have entered the country illegally and then through some legal process gotten their immigration status. And I've helped lots of people in that situation as well. So, a lot of times when people talk about immigration, they almost take for granted that the fact that somebody might be here illegally is itself a problem that needs to be addressed. I would ask how many people have looked at, how many presenters or the initial presenters, when we discussed the issue of problems with immigration, if you took out the fact that there was a legal violation of law, what are the remaining problems besides that? Where have immigrants benefited our community despite being here undocumented? Where have they improved the economy despite being here without legal status? And then what remedies could you solve to improve whatever conditions there are? Like, however, the major impact of undocumented immigration on the economy is really that it just depresses wages, because the undocumented immigrants can be paid a lower wage through a secondary labor market. That can be solved with the issuance of work authorization cards. So when we talk about the problems of immigration, oftentimes there's a cultural aspect to that. And there's a cultural view as to how much is too much, or which immigrants are desirable or not desirable. So in my practice, I've dealt with work visas. I've gone through the process in a lot of detail. I understand H-1B visas and specialty occupation visas, and the need for more of those, as well as the idea that an immigrant's value is not necessarily solely in their what they can bring to the labor market, and that there's a broader issue and a more global issue at play in terms of allowing people to come into this country and bring with them what they can, regardless of how much assimilation they can do, or whether some of their assimilation won't be to somebody's arbitrary standard of how much assimilation is enough. When we talk about assimilation, it tends to, I always wonder exactly what kind of assimilation we're talking about, because the Montanans that I've run into, the new immigrants who have come to Montana to live there, they have assimilated in the sense that they're working, they're providing for themselves and their family, they're contributing to the economy by spending the money that they earn. They're trying the best they can to buy houses. Sometimes when they're undocumented, they have a hard time getting a loan and going through other types of things that the rest of us take for granted. But nevertheless, they are assimilated, perhaps not in language all the time, perhaps not in skin tone or cultural background, but they are assimilated in the sense that they are a part of our economy, and they are contributing to I think, changing the state of Montana, because Montana is a large state with a low population, and a lot of people call Montana the last best place, and I think that's probably accurate, at least in the last part. But Montana is one of the states where very few people come. It's why we have 2% of the foreign-born population. But my clients, when they've come to Montana, the main reasons they've come is for for security, there's low crime. They like the open space. They like the low housing prices. And they think it's a good place to raise a family. So I think those are the primary things that bring people to the state of Montana. I have worked on a lot of different issues, like I mentioned, and I'll just kind of be open to some comments or questions later. But I think I'll just conclude it right there. Thanks.
Thank you, Shahid. So our next presenter is Dr. Victor Macias Gonzalez. And Dr. Macias Gonzalez is in his 19th year at the University of Wisconsin-La Crosse, where his work is really done in a wide variety of different underrepresented communities, including our immigrant community and refugee community in the area. So ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Victor.
Thank you. So what's a historian of 19th century Mexican elites doing here? Because that's what I do. So I study social and cultural capital, and that has led me to develop that social and cultural capital among underrepresented students. So that's the connection there. And then also trying to understand why great places in the Midwest don't have the social and cultural capital to understand the opportunities that immigrants and more diverse populations bring them, how they can strengthen them. So my work has been, over the last 20 years, has been to help my campus outreach to the community, in broadly conceived, and to bring to the community the talent, the experience of faculty, of students, to help the community retool, to help the community adjust, to become more welcoming as a more expanding immigrant population is present. This is made possible because often in many of our campuses, we are a center of diversity. You know, we have diverse faculty with diverse experiences. We have a growing diverse student population. I'll show you one of the slides in a second. But we also have mission statements that tell us, go out there, go engage, go globalize, go diversify. So the universities are great tool sheds that you can raid at any time. Not to take our funds to fund something else, but rather to help you find the solutions that you're seeking. To help you, primarily, one of the things I want to talk about is how we can help you to develop human capital, because this is really what we're talking about here. Short term, but also long term. What can we do in that field? So in my talk then, I want to also mention a little bit, we're talking a lot about immigrants, but often the line between immigrant and diverse populations is not clear, right? Latinos have historically been present in what used to be ours. The Spanish Empire did claim this part of the world for quite a long time. And so the case of Latino immigrants is complex, right? It's talking about the long-term historical trends as well, right? Another thing I want to talk about is how it was that we got into the business of developing programs to outreach to these communities, and then share with you some of those lessons. So do I advance with the green arrow? Well, imagine that. Yeah, that would be the big green arrow in the middle of it. There we go. All right. So there's a lot of information on here. Don't read it. You can read it later. Listen to me. I say that to my students. Basically, what we found when I first came to La Crosse, and we had about a dozen Latino faculty and about 100 Latino students in a campus that was about 10,000 and overwhelmingly white. We found that there were a lot of Latinos coming into our communities, primarily to work in light manufacture, in farming, in dairy. The numbers basically, as of the last census, show about 7,500 Latinos in the 5-county region of western Wisconsin around La Crosse out of a population of 245,000. Then in bordering Iowa and Minnesota counties, we have about another 12,500. So that, for my campus, means there are potentially 20,000 people from whom we can now recruit to make up for the dropping number of white college-age traditional populations. But in doing so, we also discovered, like many of our social agencies and employers discovered, we had been used to Latinos that historically have come to the upper Midwest that were from Texas, that were highly Hispanicized, meaning they were Spanish speaking. And yet here we were coming across populations that did not speak Spanish. Spanish was just as foreign to them despite 500 years of occupation as English, right? So we were coming across Latino populations that were Mixtec, that were Mam, that were Setzal, Tojolobal, right? And they were being approached by social agencies and church groups that trotted out someone who spoke Spanish. And no, nothing was happening, right? Imagine treating women for STDs and not having the language or the sensitivity to how do we discuss these issues with these populations. So that became a problem that many of our student interns reported back, and we thought, well, we have to do something about this. So a number of language faculty, in addition to Latino faculty, became involved in many different projects. We've now had about 4 different initiatives working with communities to try to develop some more culturally competent services, cultural competency among service providers. We also wanted to bring together people within the community of various minds on the issue of immigration, together with practitioners in the field, people that were actually working with these communities to share what's happening. So we developed an annual conference, and there people come and do a lot of recruiting. We find out from the students that are presenting on their research, but also trying to find out what works, what can we do, how can we approach this issue. We also created some community conversations around this issue, and a lot of this was with faith-based communities. Yes, the liberals are interested in talking to faith-based communities because they get it, and we're interested in helping them to service these communities. Developing ideas about, do we need to create a Latino-specific community center? Do we need to create some protocols for how to reach out, et cetera, right? So lots of work there, right? A lot of the impetus for this came from the growing numbers of Latino students on our campus, right? When I first got there, we had 115. Presently, we're almost at 400, right? UW-La Crosse is rapidly approaching 10% minority population. So it's a significant change from the 4 or 5% that we were a decade ago. And so this means that there's more people interested in providing some kind of community engagement and volunteering for some of the things that we're doing. And so we have developed, and here are just 4 of our Latino faculty and staff on campus and some of our students getting together. A lot of this is also taking folks that are not necessarily Latino, who have the language skills and who have an interest as a result of their readings, as a result of their classes, as a result of the research, and then taking them out and allowing them to volunteer everywhere from either developing lessons in Spanish, lessons in English, lessons in computers, driving people to medical appointments. A big issue, a big issue for these communities is the issue around driver's licenses. How can these people show up to work if they do not have licenses to get there? If they're afraid of leaving their homes, they're so afraid of leaving their homes, they cannot go to the doctor to get treated, right? So there's a lot of medical issues linked to this. There's a lot of need for bilingual, trilingual, psychological and counseling services in these communities. What do you think the life of kids, these are 5, 6, 7-year-old kids, is like when they're afraid that mom is not going to be home when they come back? when they're afraid that when they need to have a backup plan for what to do when the chicken processing plant gets raided or the furniture factory gets raided. So, or speaking outside of the Latino community, among some of the other immigrants, the immigrants that have come from war, the immigrants that have seen death. What's it like on a day like yesterday when they were all marched out to salute the flag and there were soldiers there? How is that affecting immigrant children as well, right? So lots of conversations and lots of awareness is being created from this type of work that we do. And I'm very happy that we're able to do this. But also, for our campus, this represented an opportunity to develop connections, to bring in future students, and we developed everything from after-school tutoring programs, retreats for Latina students, training medical practitioners to work with these populations. And then one of the things I'm very proud of is Parent College, teaching parents to be good allies and advocates for their children, and even having some parents say, well, how can I go to college? What are some things that I can do to get some of these skills as well? So these are some of the programs that you can try. Another last big issue, and I already saw the minutes, so I'll finish up with this, is if we're going to be developing and looking to this population to provide labor, we need to provide them with access to education. And what sort of message are you sending when you are charging these families that make less than $40,000 a year out of state tuition, right? It's crazy. It is absolutely crazy. It's led to us working with community groups to help them raise scholarship funds, right? Because these kids cannot go there, right? And you'll also see at the end some of our best practices that we make available to you to explore. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And I know that 10 minutes goes really, really fast when you're up here and you're passionate. So thank you for your remarks, Victor. Our last panelist for the day is Michelle Rivero. She just recently joined as the director of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs at the City of Minneapolis, where she provides guidance for elected leaders, for policymakers, and for city staff on issues relating to immigrants and refugees. So let's welcome Michelle.
Thank you so much for the invitation to be here today, President Kashkari. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to talk immigration. Can everyone hear me? Yes, okay, we're good. So I have practiced as an immigration attorney for the majority of my career. About 15 years, I've been with the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs for a mere 4 months. And I can tell you, I'd like to take a quick step back to the beginning of 2017, the beginning of the current presidential administration, and share that I was frankly terrified, waking up in the morning at 4, trying to identify how I could best assist my immigration clients who were also terrified, and how I could provide support to immigrant and refugee communities in Minnesota. Thankfully, the City of Minneapolis was thinking along the same lines as in the beginning of 2017. The mayor and city council were in the process of establishing welcoming measures to benefit immigrant and refugee communities here in Minneapolis, including the creation of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, as well as additional measures, the creation of a $75,000 legal access fund for the provision of legal services to individuals who could not afford to hire an attorney. By September of 2017, an immigrant rights group, the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee, had included the creation of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs in its 13-point platform. And by December of 2017, the mayor and city council had signed legislation to create the office. The Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs became operational in July of 2018, and I have the very great honor of being the director of this office, and I'm going to start moving through my slides. Yay! Okay, so the office structure, the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, or OIRA, is a one-person office. However, it is housed within the Department of Neighborhood and Community Relations, which has a staff of 18. It is a natural fit for our office to be within Neighborhood and Community Relations because NCR has cultural community specialists specifically focusing in the areas, among others, of Southeast Asian community, East African community, and Latinx community. So there is a natural overlap between the responsibilities of me and my office and the responsibilities of our cultural community specialists. OIRA's missions include to inform, to support, to advocate, and to collaborate. I inform city officials of federal immigration developments and their impact, from proposed rulemaking, such as a proposed rule on public charge, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, to memoranda issued by U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services that change the way applications for immigration benefits are processed. Like a recent one by USCIS that allows the service to outright deny applications for immigration benefits without giving an applicant an opportunity to respond for a request for evidence. In addition, I assist city officials in responding to comments that, whether they're unrealistic or not, have a significant impact on immigrant and refugee communities. For example, ending birthright citizenship. I also assist in the development of local solutions to the challenges created by changes in federal immigration policy. OIRA also provides support by ensuring that the concerns of our immigrant and refugee communities are heard and responded to at the city level. I also assist in providing information on immigration changes to affected immigrant communities, and identify ways that individuals in immigrant and refugee communities can obtain assistance, whether through the city enterprise itself and the various city departments or within the greater Twin Cities area. I also assist in helping foreign nationals better integrate into our city, whether it is finding what organizations can help people apply for a green card, where to go to report an instance of discrimination, participate in a fair housing forum, or be a part of city boards and commissions to weigh in on decisions made by the City of Minneapolis. Let me see. Okay, there we go. So OIRA also advocates for immigrants by participating in information sessions and forums like this one to explain the function of our office, and then also to explain immigration challenges and the immigration process. So basically like an immigration 101, because there is a great deal of many are mystified by how to even obtain immigration status in the United States. And so it's important for people to understand how challenging the immigration process truly is here. And that also increases the level of sympathy and the desire of individuals to do something. And in fact, in many of the presentations that I've given where I talk about immigration, people come up to me afterwards and ask, what can I do? Because they recognize what the challenges are and they feel like there should be community solutions to some of these challenges. Finally, while the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs does not provide direct legal representation, we do collaborate with nonprofit organizations that are contained in the Twin Cities area, which do provide direct legal representation, whether it is being able to attend a legal clinic, which is staffed by experienced immigration attorneys to understand where you're at in the immigration process or what you need to do, to full representation in immigration court proceedings. So this is a time of incredible immigration challenges, but also incredible immigration opportunities. To those who practice immigration law for a living, and I know that there are several immigration attorneys in the audience, it is clear that this administration is in fact engaged in a concerted effort to reduce inflow of immigrants in the United States, whether it is asylum applicants at the border or individuals who are applying for high-skilled visas. So it is a challenge when individuals see that there are inordinate delays in USCIS processing, outright denials of applications, and individuals who are subjected to memoranda, such as one that indicates that even if a prior application for status was approved, that previous approval is not to be granted deference when the foreign national applies for extension of immigration status, even if they're working for the same employer. If you're an immigration attorney, you know that it now takes 2 to 3 times the effort to achieve the same result, and I don't think that we've reached the end of the tunnel there. The bombardment of government initiatives to reduce eligibility for immigration status lead to fatigue, to fear, to stress, and to overload, certainly among immigrant populations. And I can give one example. When I was in private practice, there was a client of mine who was actually afraid to leave the house because she was afraid that if she set foot outside her door, she would be apprehended by immigration agents, but also by donors, individuals who fund immigration assistance for immigrant and refugee populations. For example, last year in 2017, there was a $1 million fund allocated to support of immigrant communities, and that was not repeated for this year, 2018. In addition, nonprofit organizations and private attorneys are currently working at capacity and if not beyond capacity and need additional support. I'd like to give just one quick example of a major immigration challenge that we are experiencing right now, where the public has a wonderful opportunity to comment. The notice of proposed rulemaking on public charge. This is a subject that has received a lot of attention over the course of the year. The federal government has put out several versions of public charge memoranda. In a nutshell, and I'm going to try and explain this quickly. I'm not sure if my slide has it. No, it doesn't. Can it go back? Oh, well, I'll just explain it very quickly. So public charge is an issue that typically affects individuals who are applying for green cards in the United States. If you are found to be likely to be a public charge, you can be denied permanent residence here. Currently, there are limited things that the government can look at in identifying whether you're likely to constitute a public charge. Are you receiving cash benefits? Are you receiving long-term institutional care? If you are, do you have an affidavit of support from a sponsor, which is a contract between the government and the sponsor, basically saying if the person uses public benefits after they obtain a green card, the government can come back to the sponsor and recoup their money. The proposed rule, which is 200 pages long, I'm going to describe this in 1 minute, 30 seconds, would not only increase the category of benefits that lead a person to be found to constitute a public charge to include non-monetizable benefits, but also creates this incredibly long list of additional criteria that the government can study in order to determine whether you're likely to become a public charge. And if people were aware or more aware of what criteria the government could examine, perhaps they would be very interested in this fact. For example, if you are under age 18 or over age 61, that's a negative factor. If you have a bad credit score, that could constitute a negative factor. If you have diabetes but you don't have private medical insurance, that can constitute a negative factor. If you don't speak English, that can also constitute a negative factor. Furthermore, the government is proposing to extend the public charge analysis at its discretion to non-immigrants applying for a change or extension of status, again, at its discretion. And if a determination is made that a person is likely to become a public charge, the government can make available a public charge bond with a minimum amount set at $10,000. The notice and comment period ends on December 10th. It is very easy to find out information on public charge. I would recommend that you go to the Immigrant Law Center of Minnesota website, and at the conclusion of my presentation, I do have a link to the ILCM website. As I said, challenging times, but great opportunities. There are great opportunities for collaboration in the development of new solutions to our immigration challenges. City and county development of novel ways to support immigrant populations, which include the creation of the Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs, designation of funding to immigration legal defense, as Hennepin County and Ramsey County have done, community organization activism working to help identify issue and solution, and opportunities for alignment of municipalities statewide through our elected representatives to make change that benefits Minnesota immigrant populations. And if I could leave you with just one idea, and it's not on my slide, there are a few suggestions, a couple at least of suggestions that I would make for anyone who's interested in learning more about immigration and truly identifying solutions that benefit our immigrant and refugee communities, not just statewide, but in the United States as a whole. Number one, the extension of 245I, which sunset with the Clinton administration. Myself and a fellow immigration attorney named Sandra Feist wrote an op-ed on this subject a couple of years ago. Number two, a pathway to citizenship for the 800,000 plus deferred action for childhood arrival beneficiaries. And number three, support for immigration-related legal services, not just on a municipality or a county level, but statewide or even nationwide. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to all three of the panelists for sharing your perspectives on your work and community. I know a lot of you represent different communities in the district, and maybe primarily here in the Twin Cities, but I really want to know a little bit about what are some of the characteristics of communities that have done a great job of embracing our immigrant or refugee community. And what suggestions would you have for the audience for those community members who are interested in engaging a little more deeply with our immigrant population?
Okay. I'll start? Sure. We work with 3 different communities, but I think the best example is Arcadia, Wisconsin. Arcadia began to attract particularly Central American and Mexican immigrants in the early 2000s. And there was initial lack of understanding. Well, who are these foreigners? Why are they speaking another language? What are they doing here? And it began to create a hostile situation in town. And the employees began to leave. The employers said, this has to change. So the employers began to invest in public schools, began making contributions to local funds to encourage more understanding and more community collaboration. The Chamber of Commerce, for example, created a mentoring program to work with immigrants to develop the dying downtown area. They're in the process right now of establishing a business incubator space where they can create businesses, craft shops, etc. So we saw a lot of growth in that area, but ultimately the community also recognized the dramatic demographic changes in the community. And so while these folks are 15% of the town's population, a town of about 4,000 people, they are over 50% of pre-KK, 30% of 1 through 6th, 25% of middle school, 25% of high school, right? And so the town is changing, and intermarriage is rapidly becoming a phenomenon. And I think that's something that we haven't talked about. We focus on immigration now. We should look at those other changes long term. Lots of social change. I used to smile when I realized that my first Latino students from Milwaukee or Chicago were half Polish, half Mexican, half Puerto Rican, something like that. And now that's the norm, right? That is the norm in my part of Wisconsin. And I think it's for the best.
Well, in Montana, I'd say in the Gallatin Valley area, which is in Bozeman, there just happens to be a large number of Latinos. And it's not really just a coincidence. It actually kind of started, there was a professor at Montana State University named Bethany Latique, and she decided she was going to study the Latino population there. And she not only ended up studying them, but also ended up getting to know them. And she formed a kind of informal coalition, a little group of community members, and using this, it's called a community action board. And the idea is that by selecting certain leaders from the community, people who know people who are trusted, in forming that group, we would talk to them, find out more about the larger community. And then her group ended up becoming the Montana Immigrant Justice Alliance. And with our group, what we do is, some of what we do is just hold parties. They'll have a party, but it's a great way for Latinos to get together in a big state with a low population, to get together and get to know one another. Bring in people from different cities who might not otherwise interact, and they get together. And there's also just happens to be a Spanish-speaking church in Bozeman. And there also happen to be a lot of employers who are looking to hire workers in construction and in various agricultural areas. And there's a lot of seasonal tourism in Bozeman. So a lot of those things all came together. And in Bozeman, in Big Sky, in those little areas, you'll notice that there are way more Latinos. And in those areas, I can't say that there's been any increase in crime, can't say there's been any unique problems. Assimilation, to me, it's hard for me to understand what that means. I think assimilation is really a metric of how tolerant the majority is of you. That's really all it means. And so you're measuring how much the majority is willing to tolerate or how much they dislike you. Otherwise, you're assimilated just fine because you're living your life and you're making your money. So I think it's been interesting to see in Bozeman those kind of those issues. But in terms of being a welcoming place, I just wanted to briefly mention that in 2012 in Montana, we got a very clear sense of how welcoming Montanans are to immigrants, because the legislature had referred onto the ballot this law called LR 121. And what it said it was that this law would deny state services to, quote, illegal aliens. And they would deny state services of a broad variety, including crime victim services. For some reason, they tossed infant hearing screenings on there. And there were all kinds of things, many of which were already covered by federal law, like employment, access to licenses and permits and things like that. And so in 2012, that was the year President Obama was up for election. It passed with 80% of the vote, and that was just a high number. It didn't even correlate to political party, because the other Democratic Republican races were far closer than that. So 80%. But I actually, on behalf of MIHA, the Montana Immigrant Justice Alliance, MIHA was the plaintiff in a lawsuit. I was the lawyer, and we filed suit against the state to challenge that law. And ultimately, the district court granted summary judgment in our favor and held that the law was preempted by federal law. And then the Montana Supreme Court unanimously upheld that verdict. So unfortunately, the will of 80% of Montana voters was taken down. But that goes to kind of the, in Montana, there's a very low percentage of foreign-born population, but it's an issue that they care about very much. And so there's just this huge gap. And, it kind of, I was thinking earlier as we talked about, Senator Johnson and others were talking about inefficiencies. If we were to just look at government as a business, and if we were to look for inefficiencies, well, there's a cultural inefficiency at play in a state like Montana, where there are a lot of farmers that need workers. There are a lot of people in all kinds of businesses that need workers, but the businesses themselves don't have the interest in the issue of immigration to push this. The businesses are not in Montana coming to a resolution of this issue. In fact, the businesses, because of for political reasons, the chambers of commerce align on other issues, on other sides of immigration in Montana.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Shahid. Questions from the audience? Yeah, President Kashkari.
The discussion about assimilation, have you all looked at or thought about prior generations of immigrants? Because I think many of these same concerns existed 100 years ago when there were waves of Irish immigrants or German immigrants or Italian immigrants. And I think today most Americans would say Irish and Italians and Germans have well integrated into America and are considered Americans as much as anybody else. And I'm just curious, in your experience, if you look at the newer waves of immigration, are they following a similar path of prior generations? And maybe these frictions that we're feeling today aren't so new. Yeah. They've just been experienced by prior generations, and we got through it, and we're fine, and maybe that's a source of optimism.
Yeah, I think that the patterns are or would be very similar. With immigration laws changing, that kind of interrupts some of the patterns that you might normally see, where you might normally see things going a certain way when the immigration laws never provide a solution for one family member to actually gain legal status. Then things turn a little different. But I've been struck over the years by the fact that a lot of Montanans that I talk to talk with great fondness about their family's own immigration story and then lament the current state of immigration. And what I try to make them understand, and what I wish I could make them understand, is that the clients that we're talking about are themselves trying to establish their own American dream and set up their own process of living in the United States. And their story, which may include entering the United States illegally, or which may include being in immigration court and trying to get relief to stay here, that story may not sound palatable, may not be appealing, but it's the same story of immigration, and with just a different perspective on it.
I think I would agree with Shahid from the standpoint of discrimination against newer immigrant groups. That has not changed. I believe that has existed for time immemorial. My parents are also immigrants from Italy and from Colombia, and have described to me discrimination that they've experienced throughout the years. What has changed is how much more difficult it is to obtain immigration status these days. And I can give an example of my own mother a decade ago, laughing, thinking it was so ridiculous to have to hire an immigration attorney to do her naturalization, because of course she could do it on her own. Nowadays, I would strongly recommend that someone hire an immigration attorney, because it seems more likely that USCIS is actually looking for reasons to deny applications for immigration benefits. And I think with regard to immigration court proceedings as well, it is only more challenging to obtain immigration benefits today than it was 10 or even 20 years ago, or even more.
Quite cynically, my response is, this gets traction and turns into votes, and it's something people love to yak about. But when you go and you see the children of immigrants 5-10 years after arrival, they're laughing at jokes in English, they're speaking English. 20 years down, they're intermarried. I mean, I think that many immigrants are assimilating, are acculturating and assimilating at higher rates than previous immigrant groups. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's just much, much more elevated.
Excellent. I think we have time for just one more question. Yes, gentleman in the back.
Hi, how are you doing? Thank you guys for a great conference. I really appreciate this. My name is Zachary Hilton, and I work in Ramsey County. And I just wanted to ask if you guys see any disparities that mirror racial disparities based on kind of like maybe assumed racial distinctions that might be felt or might be experienced by people that would be considered as immigrants. Mm-hmm. So basically just I'm trying to ask about whether color dynamics or perceived like racial identities impact different processes, or you spoke about assimilation and how people experience their immigrant process, I would say.
Let me give that a shot quickly. We see that a lot among Latinos, particularly discrimination against indigenous Latinos or Afro-descended Latinos. We see a lot within the community itself. There's a lot of if you study people's body language, how do people react to people that they perceive as different? You can also see a lot of racialized discrimination by immigrants that are perceived as not being white or not being white enough. So there's lots of anecdotal evidence that we could talk about. You should follow me in a department store when I'm dressed like this versus when I'm dressed like I just cleaned out my garage. It's a totally different world, and the assumptions that people make. And then when I open when I sound posh, completely different.
Just along those same lines, unfortunately, I think the answer is yes, especially in a state like Montana where there's very, very little racial diversity. Latinos stand out. They stick out like a sore thumb, and one way you see that is just in law enforcement interactions. So I guess one of the good things about being one of the only immigration attorneys in Montana is that I end up having a lot of clients all throughout the whole state. And I ended up learning from numerous different clients that they were having problems with the Montana Highway Patrol holding them and asking them questions about their immigration status. So I got all my clients together and we filed a class action lawsuit against the Montana Highway Patrol. And in the course of our discovery, we identified hundreds and hundreds of stops during which immigration was brought up, like questions from local police about somebody's immigration status or holding or prolonging a stop just because of immigration status. So we found out that all but 2 of those hundreds of cases involved Latinos. And in those cases, they were being held, whether they did or didn't have immigration status, the issue was they were being held for that reason and that reason alone. So.
Yeah. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we are out of time, and I know our panelist information is going to be online on our website at minneapolisfed.org. So if you have any questions sort of beyond today's conversation, please feel free to reach out to them and reach out to some of our staff here at the Minneapolis Fed.
So thanks, Casey, and thanks to all of you for coming today. My name is Mark Wright. I'm the research director here, and I just wanted to offer a few final remarks. But first, if you could all join with me in thanking once again all of our speakers and participants today. They've done a terrific job. As well as all of the wonderful staff who've put this together and who don't get nearly enough thanks. Thank you. So in conclusion, I think a couple of things are clear and many perhaps not. But what's clear to me, I think, is in the same way that immigration has played a very large role in shaping the history of this country, it is going to do so again in the future one way or another. The simple laws of demography and economics demand it. But of course, we can't get lost in purely thinking about the statistics, the spreadsheets, the government budget deficit, and how that's affected by immigration. We also have to recognize the fact that behind those statistics are the lives of, very real lives of many people, many families who are living in a great deal of uncertainty and a great deal of difficulty right now. Of course, it's also a very divisive time when discussing immigration. And so the second thing I think that is clear to me is that if we're going to make any progress in this, it's going to necessitate a conversation, a national conversation, between all sorts of people with all sorts of different views in an environment in which those differing views can be expressed and responded to constructively. We've seen some of those different views today, and I'm pleased to say I thought the engagement was extremely constructive. And so I look forward to being able to do that and encourage that in the future. And towards that, I just want to point to two things. First, I'd like to draw your attention to the Winter Institute Conference that will be held at St. Cloud State University in February 7th and 8th next year. It's a regular conference, and this year's theme will be immigration. So I hope you'll look into attending. But perhaps most importantly, what I like about that conference is that this year they're actually trying to make a feature of instituting a number of deliberative dialogues small group facilitated discussions in which different views can be expressed, and hopefully that will help to continue that conversation. And if the system works, if this would be a trial system, it's something I think they're going to continue to do and will be looking to do as we move forward. The second thing I wanted to note is that, as Senator Johnson mentioned this morning, the Fed has somewhat of a unique position and a responsibility as a credible and nonpartisan provider of information about these issues. And so I'm pleased to say that we will be weighing in more heavily on these issues in the future, and you can look out for that here. Now, of course, as the Fed, we will be emphasizing the statistics and the spreadsheets and the cold hard facts, but I hope you can help us by also getting out the human message that lies behind them. Lastly, if you could all do me one favor, in each of your packets there is an evaluation form. If you could take a few moments to fill that out and then hand it in to some of our staff on the way out, we'd all be very grateful. But lastly, thank you all again for coming. I really appreciate it, and I look forward to continuing the conversation with you in the future. Thank you.